We're going to begin the study of Second Samuel, in Second Samuel, and this is going to be the study of David, a man after God's own heart. But this study, unlike the last study of First Samuel, when God had blessed Samuel to become the king over Israel, in Second Samuel, he will be anointed and blessed as the king of Israel. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, as we gather together, whether it be by video or even in person, Lord, we ask for your Holy Spirit to be with us, to guide us and direct us. And as I say in all new beginnings of new studies, I ask that, Lord, you will provide the words, the knowledge that you want me to have to be able to share with people. And Lord, if I make a mistake, please forgive me. I know the awesome responsibility of teaching, and you have told us so throughout the scriptures that it is an awesome responsibility and that you're to do it as best you can and not to do it as a lie. Lord, I would never teach anything knowing that it's not true. But if for some reason I have something to say and it is not of your words that you want me to be, please forgive me and have those who are listening and following to forgive me also. I'm human. I do make mistakes. Lord, I do ask that you will be with me throughout this next few months because this is going to be a long study. There's 24, this will be a series of 24 lessons, one lesson for each chapter. Lord, just guide and direct us. Give us the patience, the fortitude, the energy that will be needed. And boy, God, we will give you all the glory and honor and praise in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, again, welcome to Linwood Community College here in Barstow. I'm your host, Les Pate, and this is exciting. This is a brand new study for me, as First Samuel was a brand new study for me also, but this one is a brand new study. And again, as I've said, the last study was before David was king. Now he is going to be anointed as king. And this is going to be the exciting conclusion, I don't want to call it conclusion, but it is, of David's life. And we're going to follow it from his, here we're going to see at the very beginning here, all the way to its conclusion, and we'll see that too. And that'd be like 6 months from now. But anyway, it's going to be exciting. I'm going to try and make it exciting. If I don't look like I'm falling asleep, well, I need somebody to come over and wake up, that type of thing. I enjoy it. I have fun doing it. God blesses me a lot because of it. And I hope to share that with you, that enthusiasm, that you too will enjoy it. And so let's just dig in. I think that's the best thing. And let's start with chapter 1, verse 1. And here we go. Now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites. Now, for those who have not followed along in our studies, I have to stop there and give you a brief history of what this verse is referring to. And here we see there in the David in the days of stayed in Ziklag. Ziklag. This was the city that King Achish of Gath had given David for, in his thoughts of his defection from Israel or from Saul, coming on to the enemy side of the Philistines and joining up with the enemy. And Achish said, well, look, I will give you the city of Ziklag to live, him and his 600 men and their wives. Well, at this time, there was war that has been called by the territories of the Philistines. There's 5 areas that made up the Philistine territories, and war has been declared. And the kings, the princesses, the lords of these five territories had said, "We will gather at Aphek," which is in the northern part of Israel, or of Israel. And he said, "We are going to make war upon the Israelites, and all the armies of the Philistines will gather there." And because because of David being in Ziklag, and the king there, Achish thinking that David was part of his army, part of his entourage, had called for David and said, "You will be with me as we go to war." And so David follows uh, the king, and they meet in Aphek, and he is at the tail end, the back part of Achish's army. They are passing in review, and here comes David and his 600 men. The other nobles say, who is that Hebrew? Why is he here?" And they send him home. This, as we see, is God's hand at work, because he knows that he is not going to have David fight against his own countrymen. But while they are gone, and this is the part that I'm getting at here that answers, or at least gives us a brief understanding of verse 1, is while they are gone, and it's about 6 to 10 days, the Amalekites raid Ziklag, and they destroy it, they burn it, and they take all the women and the children and anything of value with them, and they're leaving. And this is what they say here. He says, "And David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites." Well, as David and his men got back and they see that their home is destroyed, their women and children and livestock are gone, they are crying. They're crying out to God, "What do we do? What do we do?" And David cries out to God, and God says, go get your possessions back. I assure you that everything will be returned. Everything. Men, that means your wives. That means your children. That means your livestock. Let's go. And so they do. This is on their return and their triumphant victory over the Amalekites. And they got everything back. And here we say, on the site, and they stayed 2 days in Ziklag. Now, in verse 2, that's how we can carry on. That's what the brief history, so you'll understand what verse 1 was all about. And it says here, "On the third day, behold, it happened that a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. So it was, when he came to David, that he fell to the ground and prostrated himself. And David said to him, 'Where have you come from?' So he said to him, 'I have escaped from the camp of Israel.' Then, verse 4, then David said to him, 'How did the matter go? Please tell me.'" Let's picture this now. We see this ragamuffin, this guy that has torn clothes. He's got dust on his head. Well, actually, I think he put some dirt on his head. And he knows who King David is, because he comes directly to him and he prostrates himself. He's bowing down, and he's there in front of the king. And David's looking at him and said, "Well, who are you? Who are you?" Well, this guy is just a refugee. He's a refugee from the camp of the defeated Saul and his army. He's dressed as if he is really in a state of mourning and grief. He has his clothes torn. He has the dust on his head. Everything looks right. And if you want to see the conditions of mourning and grief, it's found throughout the Old Testament. And I'm going to give you some examples as we go through this. The first one I'll tell you is Joshua, the book of Joshua, chapter 7, verse 6. You will find a state of mourning there where the clothes were torn and the ash was put on their heads. This man is aware of who David is because he comes and he prostrates himself to him. And David wants to know who won the battle, how'd it go? And this refugee gives the accounts. And he starts with the people first. And if you look at it, he's building up to this climax he thinks that is what David needs to hear or wants to hear. And he says that the people fled and they saw the backside. In other words, they're in retreat and the Philistines are going after them. Many people were killed, he says. And then at the end, he says that even Saul and his son. Now, what's interesting to me is Saul and his sons were killed, but here it says only one. What kind of a shock do you think that brought to David? He is so used to victory after victory after victory. But to hear that the anointed king and his best friends have been killed. So it brings us to these next verses. Do we accept this guy's word for it? Let's listen to what David says. Verse 6. Then, he said, verse 5 rather. So David said to the young man who told him, how do you know that Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead? So what he's saying there, he says, what evidence do you have other than you just, how do I know what you're telling me is true? Is this by your observation or is this by word of report? He wants to know. And then we see the narration that this, let's go on and we'll see what the man says to him, and then I'll tell you what I think about it. Because when we start comparing this to what really happened, this is complete fabrication. We will compare the accountings here in just a moment. Verse 6. Then the young man who told him said this. He says, as I happened by chance to be on Mount Gilboa, there was Saul leaning on his spear. And indeed the chariots and horsemen followed toward hard after him. I want to stop and pause there just for a second. When we start looking at different commentaries like this, when he says that I just happened to be there, right, it just didn't happen to be there. But when he says that he was leaning on his spear, fabrication. When he says that there was chariots and horsemen that followed after him, that is of significance. And that means that there's a strength of, it's a symbol of strength that the Philistines were after, and there was absolutely no way for the king to escape. It was hopeless for him. And that's really what that is saying here in verse 6. And we want to carry on down from 7 down on to 10 now. Verse 7. Now, when he looked behind him, king, he saw me and called to me. And I answered him, here am I, or I am. And he said to me, who are you? So I answered him, I'm an Amalekite. Verse 9. He said to me again, please stand over me and kill me, for anguish has come upon me, but my life still remains in me. So I stood over him, and I killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen, or he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head, and the bracelet that was on his arm, and have brought them to you. What a story. Sounds good, doesn't it? But it's a complete fabrication. This isn't the way it happened. There's a Bible accounting, which we're going to do right now. I want you, if you would, turn back to 1 Samuel 31, verse 3. And we're going to read from there and then listen to what this man has said. Here's the accounting of the Bible. The battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Verse 4. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, for lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me. We've discussed what that means. But the armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took the sword and fell on it. He killed himself. And when the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. I want you to then drop down to verse 8 because there's more here that is going to help us understand what this man is saying. Verse 8. So it happened the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head and stripped off his armor and sent the word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim it in the temple of their idols and among the people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreth and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. That doesn't sound like the story that we just heard, does it? One of them's lying. Well, guess who? It's this guy. And if we compare these stories, we will see that it is completely fabricated. Who are you? He says. I'm an Amalekite. Well, that should tell you something right there. An Amalekite is the enemy of Israel. But here's something more that is of interest too. Remember that the Amalekites originally were Hebrews. They come from Esau, and they're Hebrews. They have a Hebrew background, and this is going to further explain what David will do to him in just a couple of minutes. He's really this I want to call this refugee. He's nothing more than a scavenger. He's what they call after war, after battle scavenger. That's really all he is. And he claims to be an Amalekite. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. I don't know. But he claims to be. He's saying here is that King Saul would rather be killed by an Amalekite than dying by the hands of a Philistine. That's completely wrong. The Amalekite claimed responsibility for Saul's death by saying that Saul was still alive. But we know that he wasn't. He'd killed himself. It's clear that somebody is lying here. And this is a complete fabrication or story. Why? Why would he say this? It's very simple and it's obvious. He wants to ingratiate himself with this new king, David, by telling him that he is killing what he thought was David's enemy and bringing the crown and the bracelet to David and placing it at his feet. The crown and the bracelet in his hands does tell us one thing, though, that this Amalekite was there before the next day when the soldiers came to strip the bodies. So this is what it's telling me. This guy is nothing more than a scavenger after a great war. It happens. I've discussed that before. They're there. They're like buzzards. Let's go on down to 11 and 12. Here's what happens. Therefore, David took hold of his own clothes and tore them. Again, this is a show of grief and sadness. And then he follows that up with something more. And so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and Jonathan and his son, or for Saul and for Jonathan his son. for the people of the Lord and for those of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. I think David now is convinced. He believes this refugee, that he was actually there, that he saw David, or not David, he saw Jonathan and Saul dead. And so what does he do? He has genuine sorrow and grief. He does tear his clothes, and he does put ash upon his head, and he does fast, because this is the way that genuine grief and sorrow was expressed throughout the land at that time. And just as a side note, just for something to talk about if you'd like, that even the uh, customs of the Gentiles followed this routine when they mourned also. It was of interest to me. They wept, they fasted until evening. Now these two common ways of demonstrating grief is also found as other examples, and I'll give you a couple of more. And you'll find in Genesis 37:34. You'll find this type of fasting and grief in Esther 4:3. You'll also find it in the book of Joel of chapter 2, verse 12. So this is a common way of showing your sorrow and grief. It also tells me one other thing, too, that David never stopped loving Saul, Jonathan, or his countrymen. This isn't just a overall grief. It's much more than that. They cried. They wept. This was a grief of personal nature, yes, but it was also for the grief of a fallen nation. That's what this fast and this grief and this torn clothes and this ash meant. Not this vagabond. He was just putting on a show. Let's go on down to 13 and 14. Then David said to the young man who told him, "Where are you from?" He's asking that question. "Where are you from?" And he answered, "I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite." Uh-oh. Now that was mistake number one. Then he goes on, he says, "So David said to him, 'How was it you were not afraid to put forth your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?'" Remember, even Amalekites were Hebrews, and they understood that striking the God's anointed was forbidden. He should have known that, but he claims to be an Amalekite. And David's trying to explain to him, "Man, you have just made some serious errors in your story here." The man was posing to be an Amalekite, and more likely not that, he was more of a battlefield scavenger is what I wrote down. He thought by bringing the crown and the bracelet to David would be pleasing him. And he thinks that this is going to cause favor in David's eyes. He thought that, hey, I could get some really great rewards here. I could be placed in a position of honor in David's cabinet, maybe. But David asked this question. He says, "How come you were not afraid to destroy the Lord's anointed? If you're a Hebrew, you would have known better than that." This Amalekite was not a Hebrew. He did not understand about not raising a hand against the anointed one of God. David is explaining it to him here, the errors in his ways. And so we go on down to 15 and 16 because here's this guy standing here. He's thinking, man, I am going to be rewarded. I am going to get what is deserving of me. And yes, he does. Listen to what David does. Then David called one of the young men and said, go near, okay, and execute him. Oh, no. And he struck him so that he died. What does David say? He says, so David said to him, your blood is on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. In other words, by your own admission, man, you have made some very serious statements here. First of all, you claim to be an Amalekite, and that we know if we look in Deuteronomy 25:17 is to destroy all the Amalekites. Remember, the Amalekites were the first tribes that came against Israel when they crossed over into the promised land. They would ambush the Israelites. They would attack them from the rear. Those that were stragglers, they would annihilate and kill them. And Moses put a curse on them. He says, they will be wiped out. And God said, yes. Why do you want to be an Amalekite amongst the Israelites? Yeah, that's stupid, number one. And then he says, if you were a Hebrew, you would have known better, that you don't strike down God's anointed. It's kind of similar to what we're going to see in chapter 4. And I don't want to give this away too much, but we're going to see the same type of error in thinking when these two captains, they want to call it Saul's army, kill Saul's son. They're thinking that they're doing something good when they are really not. Don't want to give too much of that away. You can read that for yourself. We will discuss that in 4 weeks. Okay? But he says, your blood be upon your head. In other words, by your own admission, we're going to kill you. So he does. So what do we have here? One of the first things of being the king is to follow what God has told you to do. David follows what God tells him, and he does what is needed. You see, let's go in 17. I want to go just a little bit deeper into this too. I want to discuss this too. This killing, and you think, wow, that's awfully harsh. But it wasn't done in a fit of rage. They fasted first, and they wept, and during this time of coming to the evening, I'm sure King David thought about it. Maybe he even asked God what to do about it. But he knew that his responsibility of carrying out God's commands was first and foremost, and that had to be done. And that was one of his first edicts as being king here. Your blood is on your own hand. Let's go down to 17. And my Bible breaks this up and it says the song of the bow. Some Bibles will say the teaching of the bow, and I want to touch on both in just a second here. 17. Then David lamented with his lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan, his son. Now, let's look at that just for a minute. What does lament mean? So, well, it's a time of grief, poem, sometimes in a song, and it's a time of grief and sorrow. And this is, of course, for Saul and his son Jonathan. This is not just a surface grief, by the way. This is a deep down in the heart, pulling the heartstring, hurt for Jonathan. It was his best friend. And we will see, we know that from our study in 1 Samuel. And then I want to go to 18. And he told them to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow. And again, some Bibles will teach the children how to use the bow. Um, Indeed, it is written in the book of Jasar. That brings up a couple of things for me, and I want to teach that. Of course, if it's to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow, he is also saying, teach them how to use the bow. The bow was used symbolically here, I believe. If you remember right, Saul was struck by an arrow from the bow, and it caused him uh, great bodily damage. The bow was used to warn David of Saul's imminent pursuit of David, was going to kill him, and Jonathan used the bow to warn him. I think the bow here in the Song of the Bow is important, but it says here that it is to be written or it will be um, recorded in the book of Jasar. Now, this book is lost. Nobody knows where it is, but it is a history of the heroic ballads, if you want to call them that, of Israel and throughout Israel's history of the many different battles and historic events of their time at this time. It's lost. We also know that this book of Jasar is mentioned in Joshua. And if you'll look at that one, that's found in chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. And this is when Joshua is talking about the stopping of the sun and the moon. And it too is recorded in the book of Jasar. It's a ballad. And this is what we're going to have here in a moment. But that story about Joshua, of course, was the great battle of Gibeon. Let's see, I'm going to look here. Oh, how the mighty have fallen is the key refrain in this song or ballad, and it is bracketed with, it brackets the entire poem, and emphasis here in 1925 and 27, how the mighty has fallen. Now, which I had said, since Saul was initially injured by the arrow and the bow, um, David is going to teach his men how to use the bow for future battles. And one other thing about this book of Jasar is it's of course not in the Bible, but it is also sometimes called the Book of Canticles. So just a little bit of history for you there. It no longer exists, or if it does someday, maybe it will be found. That would be interesting, I think, and it would just really give us more of all the battles and battle ballads that the Israelites had. And there's one thing I have to do, and this is a disclaimer on my part. I am not a poet, and I know it. That's a joke. But poetry is not my thing. And to understand sometimes of what a poet is writing, I am just scratching my health. And it's, what are you saying? So, with that disclaimer, I'm going to try and do my best to interpret, with the help of commentaries, of course, what David has written here. And I'm going to go verse by verse, and we'll do it that way. And we're going to start with verse 19. And here we go. And forgive me, it's not going to sound like any song or poem that you've ever heard, but I'll do my best to give it some renderings, if you will, on my part anyway. And here we are. The beauty of Israel is slain on your high places. How the mighty has fallen. Now, in some of the commentaries that I've read, the beauty of Israel literally here is saying the gazelle or the antelope, and it symbolizes the elegance and the symmetry, as most likely is representing here Jonathan. The song begins and it ends with Saul's son. And we see here at the beginning 19, it's picked up again in verse 25, and it ends in 29 or 27, sorry. this song, this lament, is really about his best friend, Jonathan. And it says here in the high places, and what it's referring to here is the high open worship areas that are generally established in high elevations. We know that we see many times where we have the worship in mountains and things of that nature. But in this case, the high place was at Gilboa, where Saul and Jonathan are have died. And then it goes on down. It says, "And how the mighty have fallen," and they were not just Israel's slain here. The beauty it's more than that. This is about the death of Saul and of course the death of Jonathan. And they were mighty warriors uh, in battle. We know that. And I think that David is really speaking more of Jonathan here than he is of Saul. So with that in mind, we go on down and we look at verse 20. And then he says, "Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph." Now, that one I could kind of get because I understand that Gath and Ashkelon are in the territories of the Philistines. Gath is on the western side, and Ashkelon is on the Mediterranean side, and together it represents the territory of the Philistines. And what he's saying here is, do not let the ladies or the daughters rejoice as Israel had rejoiced over the sacking and the killing of the Philistines. He says, I don't want to see that. I don't want to see my countrymen being, because of the slaughter that has happened here, I don't want to have the enemy rejoicing as we had done against them. And that I can see. He it just he did not want to see them gloat over the demise of Israel and the slain. And so he's saying here, do not let this happen. Verse 21, he says, "O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew nor rain upon you, nor fields of offerings, for the shield of the mighty is cast away there, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil." Now, this is speaking of the shield of Saul, which had been taken and set up as a symbol of their victory. And we remember that. The sword, of course, and those, they're setting them up in their temples and symbolizing their victory and giving their God all the victory and of having this victory over Israel. But what David is also doing here is he is praying to the Lord that God would withhold rain from the place where this victory was set up. He wants them to be aware that the Lord's displeasure is in the defamation and the character of God's anointed. David is also praying to God to withhold the crops from the Philistines. That's what that verse is saying. And then verse 22. "From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty." You know, Jonathan and Saul were both mighty warriors, and we know that. They had come back from many, many battles with blood on their swords. Now, and this is the sad part, their swords and their shields were in the process, or in the possession rather, of the Philistines. To me, that's what that verse is saying. Verse 23. "Saul and Jonathan were beloved, pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than the eagles, and they were stronger than lions." You know what David is doing here is like many of us do, especially those who have had to lead funerals. I've done many, and pastors done one. I know Saul, Lefty has too. But what we do when we try to look upon, or especially if it's a friend, we try to look at the past and we try to look at their lives and what they have done and look at only the good. And here's what we're seeing here. Even though Saul had been after David for those many years, he looks beyond that and he's giving the highlights, the good. He was unable to see the faults of Saul. He remembers only the good things. And true, Saul and Jonathan were powerful men of war, winning many battles. Even though Saul knew he would die, even at this battle, he did not hesitate to run or hide. He forgot he fought as a brave soldier. He was also strong physically. That's what it means here. He was stronger than a lion's. Verse 24. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. This refers, of course, to Saul's divisions among the people, where he would give the spoils of war to the people, their prosperity, resulting from the many successful campaigns that Saul and Jonathan had encountered. This weeping that David is calling for over Saul is for them, for these material things that he had furnished them with throughout the battles of their lifetime. And one must also remember that Saul's light at last has gone out under a cloud of crushing defeat here, and he had been able to successfully be a warrior. The Philistines, the Ammonites, the Amalekites, and others had felt the power of his arm, and the relations of Israel to the surrounding nations had been wonderfully changed for the better during his reign. Speaks here in verse 24. And then again in 25, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. And why I think this is more for Jonathan than David or than for Saul. It says, Jonathan was slain in your high places. We come then to verse 26, controversial maybe, but I'll try to explain it the best I can in my thinking. And here we go. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of a woman. Now, this doesn't mean homosexuality. That has nothing to do with it. Get that out of your mind if that's what you're thinking. What I do want to emphasize here is your best friend. We look at these things today and we flippantly think of BFF, best friends forever. And we put that on our letters, our messages, and then something happens and you say, I don't want to talk to him anymore. He's not my BFF anymore. You erase them. You take them off. You don't want them to even be able to see what you are doing or saying. This is far more than this. This is David's very best friend. The question I have you ever had a best friend? One that you could call your soulmate, one that you could say that he is there or she is there, no matter what, thick, thin, ups, valleys, low points. A person that if you were to fall into the gutter is there to pick you up and clean you up and still love you. A person that is there no matter what. A friendship that has been made in a covenant before God. This is the type of friendship that David and Jonathan had. They made a covenant before God, an oath that they took. An oath then meant something. They watched each other's back. David watched his, and Jonathan watched his. They took an oath to death. This wasn't BFF. Delete. No, it was far more than that. They based their friendship on this covenant with God, not just to each other. They based their friendship on more than that. They did not let anything come between them, not their career, not even their family problems. Remember, when David killed Goliath, Jonathan came to him and gave him his armament, saying, before his dad, he's saying, I am giving you everything that I have, even my position in life of being next in line to be heir of Israel. I give that to you, David. His dad didn't like that, of course. So there's a rift between father and son. But did that come between David and Jonathan? No, it did not. They drew closer and closer to friends. Their friendship would last through pitfalls, highs and lows, and they remained friends to the end. No, this was not a BFF one day and deleted the next. This was a deep down admiration, a love, and a hurt, all in the same time. Yes. This was a kindred spirit, the kind of love that you can give. Doesn't have to be physical, but it is a love for a best friend forever. That's what this means. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. David loved Jonathan. Jonathan loved David to the very end. That is what this poem means. Till next week, may God bless you richly. Amen.